They told her I was dead.
Who told you that?
Her teacher. She pulled me aside after I finally found the school.
Wait. Poppy thinks you died?
They held a little service. Her mother told the class her daddy passed away.
That's insane. You're standing right here.
I know I'm standing right here. Try telling a courthouse that.
There has to be a record. A birth certificate. Something.
They changed her last name. New state. New school. New father.
And nobody checked?
Everybody checked. Everybody saw a restraining order with my name on it.
You have a restraining order?
I never threatened anyone in my life. I never even saw the paperwork until it was already filed.
Then somebody forged it.
Somebody with money forged it. And my little girl lights a star every night. For a man she's been told is in the ground.
The teacher had said that last part to him in the school parking lot, quietly, glancing over her shoulder like she was doing something dangerous, which in a town Grant Ellison had a hand in, she was. And when the teacher had gently asked her about it one afternoon, the girl had said her daddy taught her that when she missed him, she should find the star, and that she still turned hers on every single night, even though her mommy said he was in heaven now and couldn't see it anymore. The teacher had looked at Ray Merrill standing there in his work boots, holding a photograph of a little girl, a man everyone in 2 counties believed was either dead or dangerous, and she had made the decision most people spend their whole lives carefully never making. She had decided not to look away. Ray Merrill was an electrician. He lived in Coldwater, Michigan, in a small rented house with a bedroom he kept exactly the way an 8-year-old had left it 400 days ago. He was not an impressive man to look at. He drove a truck with a ladder rack and a coffee stain that had become permanent. His hands were rough and burned in small places from 30 years of other people's wiring. When he stood in a courtroom next to the family that had taken his daughter, he could feel the room decide about him before he opened his mouth. He was the guy who fixed your outlets. They were the family whose name was on the hospital wing. In a contest of whose word counted, Ray had learned, a tradesman's word weighs about as much as the dust on his boots. He had been the one who raised her. That was the part no one seemed able to hold in their heads. After the divorce 3 years ago, Poppy had lived with him more nights than not. He was the one who learned to do the tight French braid from a video, badly at first, then well enough that she stopped asking for her mother to redo it. He was the one who packed the lunches, who knew she would only eat the sandwich if it was cut on the diagonal, who sat on the floor by her bed when she was afraid of the dark. And being an electrician, he had finally solved that fear the only way he truly knew how. He built her a nightlight, not a store one. He cut a 5-pointed star out of thin sheet metal in his shop, filed the edges smooth so she could never catch a finger, wired a soft warm bulb behind it, and mounted it on a little switch right beside her pillow where her small hand could reach it in the dark. Then he told her the truest thing he knew how to say to a frightened child. When you miss me, you turn on the star. And wherever I am, that means I am thinking about you too, at the very same time. It runs both ways, like everything electric does. She had loved that. She used to test it, calling him late from her mother's house to ask if he had felt her turn it on. And he always said yes, because it was always true. For 2 years, that little star was the most reliable thing in either of their lives. Then Lauren met Grant Ellison, and everything changed. And Ray did not understand how completely until it was almost too late. If you have ever been erased from a life you built with your own 2 hands, told you are gone by people who are looking right at you, stay with this one until the end. Because there is a thing that a lie cannot reach, no matter how much money is behind it. And Grant Ellison, who could buy almost anything, forgot that this one thing was not for sale. You can turn off the lights. You cannot turn off who someone is to a child. Grant Ellison developed shopping centers and apartment blocks across 3 counties. He gave generously to the hospital, sat on the library board, sponsored the Youth Baseball League, and had the kind of easy, practiced smile that made people apologize for taking up his valuable time. He was, by every visible measure, a good man, and he had worked hard to make sure every measure that mattered stayed visible. When he married Lauren 2 years ago, he did not simply marry a woman. He acquired a situation, and Grant Ellison did not tolerate loose situations, the same way he did not tolerate an unbalanced ledger or a permit left pending. The loose part was Ray, the ex-husband who kept showing up for his scheduled weekends, ordinary and quiet and impossible to buy out or scare off, standing on the porch in his work boots like a splinter that would not work its way loose, no matter how the flesh grew over it. And then, 400 days ago, the splinter had become something worse than an inconvenience. It had become a threat, because Ray Merrill, years before he ever knew Grant Ellison's name, had done the wiring on one of Grant's early buildings. And Ray did not know it yet, but he was carrying a loaded gun in his memory and his old work records, and Grant had realized it before Ray did. The way they cut him off was surgical, and Ray could only see the precision of it in hindsight. A restraining order appeared, citing incidents that had never happened, on dates Ray could prove he had been elsewhere, witnessed by people he had never met and could not locate. It was granted quickly by a court that saw a wealthy, stable, generous family on one side, and a rough-handed man with no lawyer and no money on the other, and made the easy assumption. By the time Ray understood what was even in the document, it was already law, already enforceable, already a wall. And it was a clever wall, because it inverted everything. Contact with his own daughter was now a crime. Every time he drove to the house to see her, he was the one breaking the law. Every call he made to check on her was logged as harassment. They moved Poppy across the state line into a district where not one person knew her face or her history, enrolled her under Grant's surname so that even her paper trail no longer led to Ray, and told an 8-year-old girl and every adult around her that her father had died. It was, Ray came to understand, a masterpiece of a particular cold kind. You do not have to hide a living man if you can get everyone to agree he is dead. A dead man cannot violate a restraining order. A dead man's phone calls are the grief fantasy of a confused little girl. A dead man who keeps insisting he is alive is not a father being wronged. He is an unstable obsessive who cannot accept a loss, and the more he insists, the crazier he looks. So Ray spent 400 days throwing his whole body against a wall of paper, and every time he pushed, the paper pushed back harder, and the town watched the persistent electrician insisting he was alive and being kept from a daughter who had buried him. And the town saw precisely what Grant Ellison had engineered it to see: a sad, broken man who would not let go. Nobody wants to look closely at that man. Everybody crosses the street, and that averted gaze, multiplied across a whole community, was the strongest bar in the whole cage. But here is the thing about a man who wires houses for a living. He understands, in his hands, that the most dangerous currents are the ones you cannot see, and that the way you prove an invisible thing is real is you find where it leaves a mark. Ray could not prove he was a good father with his feelings, so he did the only thing he knew how to do. He kept a record. For 400 nights, alone in the small rented house, Ray Merrill wrote his daughter a letter, one every night, without fail, the way other men take medicine. He had no address to send them to, because for half that time he did not even know what state she was in, and later he was forbidden by law from reaching her at all, so he did not mail them. He wrote them by hand, dated each one in the corner, and put them in a shoebox. And when the shoebox filled, he started a second, and when that filled, he moved them to a plastic bin. He told her about his day, the job he was on, the dog he saw, the thing that made him think of her. He told her he loved her. He told her the star was still on, because it was. That was the part that would have broken a stranger's heart to see. Ray had built a second star, identical to the one by her pillow, cut from the same sheet of metal, and he had mounted it on the wall of the bedroom. He could not bring himself to change. The small room that still held her drawings and her folded clothes and the height marks by the door. And every single night, before he sat down to write, he reached over and switched it on, so that a warm little star burned steadily in an empty room, in an empty house, for a girl 3 states away who had been told her father was in the ground. He would sit under it and write, and then he would leave it burning while he slept, because turning it off felt too much like agreeing with them. If you have ever kept a light on for someone who could not see it, night after night, with no proof it would ever matter, you already understand the whole of this man. The teacher's name was Mrs. Dunbar. After the parking lot, she did not stop. She was not a brave woman by nature, she told Ray later. She was a 50-year-old grade school teacher, 2 years from a pension, and she had a mortgage and no interest in trouble. She just could not sleep after a child had said the word heaven to her in a voice that did not believe it. So she began, carefully, quietly, to pay attention. And what she noticed was small and enormous at the same time. Poppy, the girl whose father was dead, talked about him in the present tense. It slipped out in the ordinary ways children reveal what they actually believe. In a story she wrote for a class assignment, she described her dad fixing a broken lamp, making the light come back, and she wrote it in plain present tense. My dad fixes things. My dad knows about electricity, and Ms. Dunbar had marked no grammatical error on it, because the child was not making an error. The child simply did not believe her father was in the past. A dead thing does not leave a live current running through an 8-year-old's verbs. And there was the star, always the star, in the corner of every drawing, a small, 5-pointed star that the girl said her daddy taught her, that she still turned on every single night, she said, even though her mom said he was in heaven now and couldn't see it. Ms. Dunbar had taught for a long time. She had sat with a great many grieving children over the years, and she knew, the way you know a thing in your chest before you can defend it, the exact difference between a child who is mourning and a child who is quietly, stubbornly waiting. She was the first ally. The second came from a direction Ray never expected, and it broke something open in the case and in him. A woman began leaving him things. It started with a plain envelope in his truck, no note, containing a photocopy of the restraining order with a date circled, a date on which Ray could prove he had been 300 miles away rewiring a school gymnasium, meaning the incident it described was impossible. Then a copy of Poppy's new enrollment form showing the changed name. Then a scrap of a travel itinerary. Someone on the inside was feeding him the map to his own erasure, piece by piece, and doing it in terror, because each drop came with the trembling carefulness of a person who knew exactly what would happen to them if they were caught. For weeks, Ray assumed it was Aunt Renee, Lauren's younger sister, who had always been kind to him and had gone silent and guilty since the marriage. And Renee was helping, that part was true. But the person leaving the envelopes, the one risking the most, taking documents from inside the house itself, was not Renee. It was Lauren, his ex-wife, the woman who had told their daughter he was dead, the woman whose name was on the petition, who had stood in a courtroom and let it all happen, who had built the lie and then lived inside it for 400 days. She was the one slipping him the tools to tear it down. Ray sat in his truck outside a hardware store the afternoon he figured it out, holding an envelope that could only have come from inside the house, and he could not make the two facts hold still together. The person who had done this to him was the person trying to undo it. It did not fit any story he had told himself in the long nights, in which Lauren was simply the woman who had chosen money and let their daughter be lied to. But that was the truth, and it was uglier and more human than any simple villain, because Lauren had not married a monster and then discovered it too late. She had married a powerful man and been folded, slowly, one small surrender at a time, into his control. She had told herself each terrible step was to protect Poppy, that a stable, rich home was better, that Ray would be fine, that the lie was a kindness, until she woke one morning as the co-author of a story that had killed her daughter's father on paper. And she had been too afraid of Grant Ellison to walk into a police station and say so out loud, because she had seen, up close, what happened to people who became inconvenient to him. So she did the only brave thing a terrified person can still do. She left the door unlocked in the dark and prayed that someone braver would come through it. This is the moment I need you to sit with, because it is the hinge of the whole thing. The woman the whole town would call the villain, the mother who told a child her father was dead, was also the only person on earth with both the courage and the access to hand that father the means to come back to life. Grant had counted on Lauren staying one thing, staying afraid, staying his. He had built his entire fortress on the certainty that she would never move. He had not counted on the part of her that was still, underneath all the fear and all the money, Poppy's mother, and that part had been quietly, terrified, unlocking doors the whole time. What Lauren's envelopes finally revealed was the why, and the why was so much larger than a bitter divorce that Ray had to pull the truck over when he understood it. 6 years earlier, Before Ray had ever heard the name Ellison, he had done the electrical work on a small apartment building on the east side of a city 2 counties over, a rush job for a developer who was cutting every corner he could reach. Ray had flagged the panel work as unsafe, in writing, on the standard inspection form, noting the specific fault: the undersized wiring feeding an overloaded panel, a fire waiting for a busy evening. He had been overruled, told the schedule did not allow it, and taken off the job when he would not sign off. And he had kept his copy of the flagged report the way careful tradesmen keep everything, in a banker's box in his garage, filed and forgotten. One more time, he had been right and ignored. 8 months after Ray was pulled off that job, the building had an electrical fire. It started, a fire marshal's own notes would later say, at the exact overloaded panel Ray had flagged. A family on the second floor did not get out in time. A child died in that fire. But the official cause was ruled a tenant's faulty space heater. The developer paid a small, quiet settlement to a family with no lawyer and no leverage, and the story went away the way these stories go away when the dead are poor and the builder is rising. Ray had read about it in the paper at the time, felt the cold drop of a man who suspects, and had no way to prove anything, and had eventually let it settle into the general grief a decent person carries about a world that does not listen. The developer was Grant Ellison, and the one man alive who had documented in his own hand 6 years before that the building's wiring was a death trap was the electrician who had gone on to marry and then divorce the woman Grant would one day take as his wife. Grant had not realized it at first either, but somewhere in the second year of that marriage, idly going through Lauren's history, connecting an ex-husband's name to a face, to a trade, to an old job file, Grant Ellison had felt the floor tilt under his expensive shoes. His new wife's stubborn, ordinary, impossible-to-buy ex-husband was sitting on the one piece of paper on earth that could turn a tragic accident into negligent homicide, into manslaughter, into the end of everything Grant had built on top of that buried child. Ray was not a nuisance to be managed. Ray was a witness to be erased. And Grant Ellison had learned, a long time ago, in the worst way, that he did not leave witnesses standing where a court could ever reach them. So he had not just taken Ray's daughter. He had chosen the single cruelest cage imaginable for a witness. One built entirely, ingeniously, out of that witness's own love. Bury the man alive under a false death. Discredit him in advance as an unstable obsessive so that anything he ever said would sound like the raving of a broken man. Move the child, and, with her, the evidence out of reach across a state line. And the loaded gun sitting in the electrician's memory and his garage would never once go off. Because who on earth believes a dead man? And who bothers to truly listen to a father the whole town has already agreed to pity and dismiss? It was elegant. It was patient. It was the work of a man who had gotten away with something enormous once and had learned to trust his own coldness. If you have ever watched a powerful person weaponize the plain goodness of a decent one, turn a man's love into the very bars that hold him, this next part will stay with you a long time, because Grant Ellison was about to discover the one flaw in his beautiful design. The same love he had chosen to build the cage out of was the one current in the world he could never fully ground. Ray took everything to a legal aid attorney, a young, overworked woman named Marisol Sandoval, who worked out of a strip mall office and took cases the big firms would not touch. She looked at the forged restraining order, the impossible dates, the enrollment records, the 6-year-old safety report, and Lauren's envelopes, and she did the math that Ray had been too close to see. Separately, each piece was deniable. Together, they were a machine. A false legal filing to sever the father. A cross-country move to hide the child. A death told to a little girl to close the last door. And underneath it all, a motive that turned the whole thing from a custody dispute into the cover-up of a child's death. She told Ray they had a real case. She also told him the truth she owed him, that Grant Ellison would see them coming, and that a man who had covered up a homicide would not fold quietly when the walls came in. She was right. The moment Ray's attorney filed to challenge the restraining order and requested the old building records be preserved, Grant moved, and he moved with the speed of a man who had been ready for this for years. 2 things happened in the same week. First, the records. When Marisol subpoenaed the building department's file on the East Side apartment fire, the electrical inspection records for that address had gone missing from the county archive, pulled, Ray was sure, by someone Grant owned. His own copy in the garage banker's box was suddenly the only one left, and that made it precious, and made him a target. Second, and worse, Grant came for the endgame. He had always intended, if pushed, to put the child fully out of reach, and now he was pushed. Ray's attorney learned, through a panicked call from Lauren, that Grant had moved up a long-planned family trip. He held property abroad. He had passports. He was preparing to take Poppy out of the country within days, ahead of any hearing, to a place where American custody paper meant nothing and a determined electrician could never follow. And to make sure Ray could not interfere in those crucial days, Grant sprang the last part of the trap. He reported Ray for violating the restraining order, produced a witness who swore Ray had come to the new house and had him arrested. So there it was, the bottom, and it was total. Ray Merrill sat in a holding cell in a county that was not his own, charged with violating an order he had never agreed to, while 300 miles away, a plane ticket sat in a folder with his daughter's new name on it, and the clock ran out 1 hour at a time. He had spent 400 days keeping a light on in an empty room, and now the room itself was going to move to another continent, and he was behind steel, and there was nothing his rough, capable hands could reach. The cell had a fluorescent tube in the ceiling behind a metal grate, buzzing, flickering at one end, and Ray lay on the bench and stared up at a bad ballast he could have fixed in his sleep on the outside and could not touch in here, and the smallness of that, a broken light he was not allowed to mend, was somehow the thing that nearly finished him. I will not pretend he stayed calm. There is a moment they do not put in the inspiring version of these stories, when a good man alone in a cell understands the full weight of what money can do to someone who has none, and something in him buckles. Ray sat up and put his head in his burned hands and did the cold arithmetic of despair. His girl would grow up on another continent believing he was dead. She would stop eventually, turning on the star, because you cannot keep a light burning for a ghost forever, not at 8, not when everyone you trust tells you the ghost was never real. The light in the empty room back home would go on burning for no one until the bulb finally failed in the dark. And the man who had killed a child and buried the proof under Ray's own love would win, cleanly, permanently, and be applauded at the next hospital gala for his generosity. And then Ray did the thing that separates the men who break from the men who bend. He picked the current back up, because he remembered, sitting on that steel bench under the flickering tube, a plain fact from his own trade. A circuit does not need the source standing right there to keep carrying what was already sent down the line. He had spent 400 nights building something that did not depend on him being free to finish it. The letters existed, dated, 400 of them. The report existed, in a banker's box in his garage. Lauren had finally, fully chosen. Ms. Dunbar was watching and would not look away. Marisol was filing. The truth was already moving through wires Ray had laid long before this cell was ever locked, and a man in a cage cannot stop a current he set running while he was still free. So Ray lifted his head, and he asked for his phone call, and he did not use it to despair. He used it to give his attorney the one thing only he knew in the whole world: the exact shelf, the exact box, the exact spot in the garage where the 6-year-old inspection report was waiting. The original, the last copy left on Earth. The hearing fell in the same narrow window as Grant's flight, and everything came down to whether paper could move faster than a private plane. Marisol went to a judge with an emergency motion, and she did not lead with the custody fight, because the custody fight was still, on its face, Ray's word against a mogul's, and she knew which way that broke. So she led with the fire instead. She laid the 6-year-old inspection report in Ray's documented hand, down on the desk beside the death certificate of a child, and she requested an emergency hold on the international travel of both Grant Ellison and the minor in his household. Her grounds were narrow and sharp. The man seeking to remove a child from the country within the week was now the subject of a freshly opened inquiry into a concealed death, and the sole surviving documentary witness to that death was, at that very moment, sitting in one of the county's own holding cells on a charge filed by that same man. A judge who might comfortably wave away an electrician's custody grievance could not, on the record, wave away a dead child, a matching fire marshal's report, and a set of inspection records that had vanished from a public archive the same week they were requested. The travel hold was granted that afternoon. The plane that was meant to carry Poppy out of the country stayed on the ground, and for the first time in 400 days, A piece of paper worked in Ray Merrill's favor instead of against him, and he felt in the cell the current he had set running years ago finally begin to flow back toward him. Then came the hearing itself, and the room was arranged exactly the way Grant liked rooms, full of people who owed him things. He arrived calm, in a suit worth more than Ray's truck, with 2 attorneys and the settled face of a man who had never lost a room in his life. He did not look at Ray in the holding area's video feed. To Grant, Ray was already a resolved matter, a dead man making noise. His lawyers argued first, and they were smooth. The restraining order was valid on its face. The father was unstable, obsessive, recently arrested for violating that very order. The child was thriving. The old fire was a closed matter, a tragedy long ago ruled accidental. And this was a desperate man dredging up ancient grief to smear a pillar of the community. For a while it worked, the way Grant's stories always worked, because he told them in a calm, expensive voice, and the room wanted to believe the calm, expensive man. Then, one by one, the people he had dismissed stood up. Ms. Dunbar testified first. This ordinary teacher, who had described herself as not a brave woman, sat in the witness chair and told the room, steadily, that the dead man's daughter spoke of her father in the present tense, that she drew a star in the corner of every picture, that she lit one for him every night, and that in a long career of teaching grieving children, she had never once seen a child grieve in the grammar of the living. A child who has truly lost a parent, Ms. Dunbar said, speaks of them in the past. This child never did. This child was not grieving. This child was waiting. The room was very quiet when she finished. Aunt Rennie testified next, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the rail. She said there had never been any incidents. She said she had sat at a family dinner where the restraining order was discussed as a thing to be built, not reported. She said she had stayed silent out of fear and shame for 400 days and could not carry it one more. Then Marisol entered the rest, methodically. The way you lay wire, one clean run at a time. The impossible dates, Ray provably 300 miles away when he was supposed to have been threatening someone. The forged witness names, the changed surname, the county archive records that had vanished the week she subpoenaed them. And then, last, she entered the inspection report. The original, 6 years old, retrieved from Ray's garage by a court officer while Ray sat in a cell, written in Ray's own careful hand, flagging the exact electrical fault that a fire marshal's own notes, once someone finally bothered to lay them side by side, matched to the origin point of the fatal fire. The room turned, the way a room turns when the calm, expensive man in the good suit stops being the safest thing in it. But Grant Ellison did not break on evidence alone. A man like that never does. His lawyers pivoted hard and fast, moving to exclude the report as improperly obtained from a jailed man's home, moving to sever the fire inquiry from the custody matter entirely, moving to paint Lauren as an unstable wife, manipulated by a vengeful ex-husband. And it might have held a while longer, because money buys time, and time was the one thing Grant still had, if he could just get the child on a plane before the paper caught up. What finished him was not a document. It was the 2 things he had been most certain, all his life, that he controlled: his wife and a child. Lauren stood up. Not as a witness, her own lawyer had prepared and coached. She stood up on her own, in the middle of the proceeding, before anyone called her, and the room went still at the sight of Grant Ellison's wife rising against him in open court. She said, out loud, into the record, that she had signed the petition, that there had been no incidents, none, ever. That she had stood in a room and told her own 8-year-old daughter that her father was dead, and had made the child attend a service, and had done all of it because she was afraid of her husband, and had told herself, every single day, that it was protection, until she could no longer stand the sound of her own voice telling the lie. She said she had been the one leaving the envelopes in the truck. She turned toward the video screen where Ray watched from the holding facility, and she said she was sorry, in a voice that did not ask to be forgiven and did not expect to be, a voice that had stopped performing anything at all. She knew exactly what it cost her to say it. It cost her the marriage. It cost her standing and reputation, and quite possibly her own custody of Poppy. And she said it anyway, all of it, because there is a point past which a mother simply cannot keep a father dead, no matter what it saves her. And Grant, for the first time in the memory of anyone in that room, lost the calm. The last thread of the thing he had always controlled had just cut itself loose in front of a judge, and he turned in his chair to look at his wife, and the smooth, benevolent mask slipped, just for a second, and underneath it, everyone saw the real face, the cold, flat fury of a man watching his entire constructed world short out at once. It was only a second. He mastered it, and folded his hands, and let his lawyers keep talking. But the whole room had seen the thing under the smile, and you cannot unsee a thing like that. The judge halted the removal on the spot, vacated the fraudulent restraining order, and referred the concealed fire to the county prosecutor for a full criminal inquiry. And so the machinery Grant Ellison had built to bury one witness became, piece by piece, the very map that investigators used to walk straight back to the death of a child he had paid a long time ago to forget. He was charged, in time, with the fire cover-up and the custody fraud both, and with the false imprisonment of the man he had jailed on an invented violation. The pillar of the community, the man whose name was on the hospital wing, learned the hard difference between the town's love, which he had rented for years with checks and galas, and the town's loyalty, which he discovered he had never actually owned. When the story broke, the same people who had crossed the street from Ray Merrill found, all at once, that they had always had their doubts about Grant Ellison, the way people always suddenly remember their doubts once it is finally safe to have them. Lauren faced what she had to face. She lost the marriage the day she stood up in that courtroom, and she carried the far heavier weight of having been a mother who told her own child a lie that enormous, a lie no apology fully reaches. The courts would spend a long time sorting what her role in Poppy's life should be, and Ray's own forgiveness, when it came slowly and in pieces, the way real forgiveness does, and the fake kind never has to. But she had opened the door in the dark, when it counted most, at the greatest risk to herself. And Poppy would grow up knowing the whole and complicated truth, that her mother had done a terrible, frightened, unforgivable thing, and had also been the one person with the courage to undo it. People are not one thing, and a child who is only ever handed the cartoon version of her own parents grows up believing a lie of a different kind. Poppy would get the real, difficult, complete truth of both the people who made her, which is more than almost any child of these quiet wars is ever given. And here is the tragedy under the man, the part that made him more than a cardboard villain. When they finally opened the sealed history of Grant Ellison, when the fire inquiry pulled at the threads he had spent 6 years pressing flat, they found the shape of the wound underneath. The child who had died in the fire he covered up had been about the age Poppy was on the day he married her mother. Grant had never once spoken of it. He had never atoned, never confessed, never so much as let the memory surface in daylight. He had simply pressed it down, poured concrete over it, and built taller and taller and taller on top, wing after wing, gala after gala, as if enough height could bury a thing that deep. And somewhere in that buried wreckage, his strange, controlling, possessive attachment to Poppy began to make a terrible kind of sense. A chance to stand guard, obsessively, over one small girl, the exact age of the one his corner-cutting had killed. A chance to be, for this child, the protector he had failed so catastrophically to be for that one. It did not excuse a single thing he had done. He had murdered a man's fatherhood in order to hide a child's death, which is a monstrous accounting no grief can balance. But it meant that the very same current running through Ray, the grief of a father over a child in danger, was running through Grant too, had been running through him for 6 years, and the two men had simply wired it in opposite directions. Ray had turned his grief into a light he kept burning in an empty room. Grant had turned his into walls and locks and lies and the slow, methodical erasure of anyone who might make him feel it. The story had always been about that one current, and the only thing that had ever really separated these two men was which way each of them chose to run it. They released Ray Merrill the next morning, the charges against him collapsing the instant the order they rested on was vacated. There was paperwork, and there was the particular slow reluctance of a system to admit that it had spent 400 days helping a wealthy man bury a living one. No one apologized. Systems do not apologize. But there came a moment when a door buzzed and unlocked, and Ray walked out into a gray Michigan morning, still wearing the clothes he had been arrested in. Blinking in a daylight, he had half stopped believing he would stand in as a free man. He had walked into that building a dead man, legally speaking, an unstable obsessive with a forged order to his name. He walked out of it as what he had always actually been, a father, and the only thing that had changed was that now, at last, the paper agreed. And across the parking lot, in the thin morning light, holding her aunt's hand, small and uncertain and searching every single face that came through the door, was a girl who had been told for 400 days that this exact moment was impossible. Poppy did not run to him at first. That is the part the sentimental version always gets wrong. She had been told he was dead. She had been made to sit through a service, to accept the casseroles of well-meaning strangers, to spend more than a year being carefully, patiently taught to unlearn her own father. You do not undo 400 days of that in one gray morning in a parking lot. She stood at the edge of the lot, holding her aunt's hand, and she looked at the man in the work boots, and something moved behind her eyes, slow, a current finding an old path it had not been allowed to run. Ray did not rush her. He knew, in a way most people would not have, that you cannot force a thing to reconnect. You make the path safe, and you wait for it to find its own way across. So he did the thing he used to do when the dark scared her. He knelt down on the cold asphalt so that he was her size, so that she was not looking up at a grown man, but across at a person on her own level. And he waited, and he let her come the distance at the exact speed a betrayed and frightened child needs to come it. She crossed the lot slowly, one careful step at a time. She stopped an arm's length away from him and studied his face, hard, the way you study something you were told to forget and never quite could, checking it against a memory she had been forbidden to keep and had kept anyway. And then she said the thing that undid every hard man standing in that parking lot, in a small, steady voice that did not shake. "I knew you weren't dead." She swallowed, and her chin trembled, but her voice held. "I turned on the star. Every night, even when Mom said you couldn't see it anymore. I did it anyway. I never stopped." Ray Merrill, who had not let himself cry in the cell or the courtroom or through any of the 400 days, came apart then, quietly, on his knees on the asphalt. He reached into the bag they had returned to him and lifted out the plastic bin he had begged Marisol to bring to the release, and he set it down on the ground between them, and he opened the lid. 400 letters, dated, one for every night, in his own hand. He told his daughter that on every single one of those nights, on the other end of that star, he had been thinking about her, exactly like he had promised her he would, that it had run both ways the entire time, just like he said, that it had never once been switched off, not for a single night, no matter what anyone told her. She looked at the letters, and at the dates climbing all the way back to the day they took her, and at her father's burned and careful hands, and an 8-year-old understood, all at once and all the way down, that she had been right the whole time, that the light she had kept lighting for a ghost had never been lighting for a ghost at all, and that being right had cost her father 400 nights, and had cost her nothing that she could not now slowly get back. Lauren faced what she had to face. She lost the marriage, and she carried the harder weight of having been a mother who told her child a lie that size, and the courts and Ray's own slow forgiveness would take years to sort. But she had opened the door in the dark when it counted, and Poppy would grow up knowing that her mother, though she had done a terrible thing, had also been the one who found the courage to undo it. People are not one thing. Poppy would need the whole truth of both her parents, and she would get it, which is more than most children of these wars ever do. They gave the girl her name back. Ray took her home to the small rented house with the bedroom he had never once changed, and on the first night, she was afraid of the dark in the room that was both new and old to her, the way children are afraid, and Ray did not say a word about being brave or about how everything was fine now. He just reached over to the little switch by her pillow, the star he had left waiting there, wired and ready for 400 nights, and he turned it on. It filled the room with the same soft warm light it always had, steady, patient, exactly the color it had been the night they took her, unchanged by any of it. She looked at it for a long time, without speaking. Then Ray went and got the second star off the wall of the empty room, the one that had burned all those nights for no one, and he mounted it on the wall beside her bed, next to the first, and he wired it into the same little switch, so that now, when she reached out her hand in the dark, 2 small stars came on together, side by side, the one that had waited by her pillow and the one that had waited in the empty house, both of them lit at last by the same hand at the same time. 2 little lights that had, it turned out, been on the whole time, burning on opposite ends of the longest dark either of them had ever had to cross. Finally, in the same room again. You can turn off the lights. Grant Ellison had money enough to turn off almost anything a man could name. A marriage, a safety record, a dead child's cause of death in a county file, a living father's entire legal existence. He turned off all of it for a while, with paper and money and that calm, expensive voice. But he could not turn off who Ray Merrill was to Poppy, because that one thing was not wired into any panel he could reach or any court he could buy. It ran on something older and deeper than current, and the proof of it was that it had stayed on in the dark for 400 nights with absolutely no one watching, which is the only real test there is of whether a light was ever true. Anyone can shine when the room is full. It is the light that keeps burning in the empty room, for no audience, on the faith that it will matter someday, that tells you what a person actually is. If this story reached something in you tonight, send it to the parent who never stopped showing up, the one somebody with more money and more polish tried to erase, and tell them you always knew they were still there. Because a child can be lied to, and moved across a state line, and given a new last name, and told to her face, at a service, that the person who loved her most is gone forever. But the truth about who actually stayed will always, always find its way home in the end. The way a current finds the ground, quietly, completely, no matter how far around you try to send it.